On that previous video, we mentioned this thing called the zero product property, right? And it looks like this. When we have two things that multiply up to zero, in this case, we have like this A thing times this B thing. They're numbers, whatever. I just don't know what they are. They multiply up to zero. What does it mean? It means, hey, maybe this one over here is zero. Or, maybe this B thing over here is zero. Or it's possible that both of them are zero, right? So the idea is to take our quadratic portion of our equation and it becomes this A times B once I factor it. And I set both of those things, those factors equal to zero in order to solve that quadratic equation, right? So if the product of two expressions is zero, at least one of those things has to be zero. It's possible that it's both, right? That's the main idea here. All right, and we'll see this thing in practice here in a moment. So we did mention the standard form of quadratic equation as being ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. This is when it's one variable. I'm able to identify that this is a quadratic equation because the highest power is 2. That's something that you want to always do. It's just happening in the background of your mind. You look at that equation, oh, it's quadratic. I want to recognize that it's quadratic, different from linear because I solve them differently, okay? And again, we're using the zero product property to solve, and notice it says certain quadratic equations when it's in this standard form. And we do that by factoring. And the reason why it says certain is because you can't factor every single quadratic. You can't, it's just like you can't factor some numbers. Let's say we have the number 17. It only factors as 1 times 17. It's not very helpful, right? Quadratic equations are the same way. If that's the case, then my fallback plan, as you'll see, is going to be the quadratic formula. All right, so here is the first one. Oh, this is already worked out for me. So let me actually come over here to Notability and I can work it out with you. So I have on exercise 5 here a quadratic equation. How do I know this is a quadratic equation? Of course, I know it's quadratic because I've got this x squared term, right? Highest power is 2. If that's the case, what I want to do is I want to set this thing equal to 0, which it already is. How helpful. And then I want to apply the zero product property. I can't apply the zero product property because this is not a product. It's got some subtraction up in it, right? It's not two things that are being multiplied. So the way that I get those two things being multiplied is this process that we call factoring. And factoring, all it is when we have quadratic is the process of foiling going backwards. And we'll see that play out here in a little bit. So let's look at this where it occurs on our green sheet. So get that green sheet back out. Boom. And we had talked about the top set of boxes here. And so let's look at this box that's right here. It says when a is equal to 1. A is that leading coefficient. It's this thing that's right there. When it's 1, these are the easier ones to factor, okay? So it says you solve that quadratic equation by factoring c, that's your constant term, into two numbers that add up to b. So here I have a 2 for my constant term. I'm looking for two numbers that multiply up to 2, and then they add up to my b number, which is -3. What times what gives me 2 and adds up to -3? And you can see the two examples right here. It's -2 times -1 gives me a +2. And if I add those two numbers together, -2 plus a -1, it happens to be -3, okay? That's the process. That's the biggest challenge in factoring is finding those two numbers. Once we find these two factors, we're going to put them into a set of parentheses side by side like this. X minus 2, that's that first factor, times x minus 1, that's that second factor. If you were to FOIL this thing out, and I'll do that in just a second, I should get this exact quadratic equation. So let's just look at that real quick. Remember, FOIL means first, outside, inside, last. The first terms, when you multiply them, you'd have x times x, which is x squared. Then you have your outside terms. That's x times -1. I guess that's a -x. My inside terms, That's a negative 2 times x gives me a negative 2x. And then finally your last terms, negative 2 times negative 1 is a positive 1. And when I add up these two middle terms, I get the negative 3x. Combining like terms, x squared minus 3x plus 1. This is the reason why this method works. So when we FOIL backwards, that's this process called factoring. And notice where those numbers are. The two numbers that we came up with, this negative 2 and this negative 1, it came from the product of these two things. Those two, negative 2 times negative 1, it turned out to be that number when we multiply them. Okay, so there's our starting place. And notice that whenever I FOIL this thing out, the outside and the inside terms, that's these two that are right here. Negative 1x minus 2x. The negative 1 and the negative 2, those came from the two numbers, the two factors again. And then I combine them up and I get that negative 3. That's how that whole entire method works. So let's try it all out from scratch. Here's a nice little example that you can always refer back to whenever you're solving some quadratic equations throughout the year and you get stuck, come back to that example. All right, so let's do one together. Oh, that's not what I wanted. I wanted this example right here. Okay. All right, so here's our C value. That's our starting place. That C value. I want to find two numbers that multiply up to that. When two numbers multiply up to something, it's called a product. I want a product of negative 7. This is my scratch work here, me thinking through the problem. Okay, and then they want to, so this is my B value, this is my C value. We want them to add up to the B value, which is negative 6. When two things add up to a particular number, that's a sum of negative 6. So I'm just going to write this off to the side. Product and sum. I want two things that multiply up to negative 7 and add up to negative 6. So what times what gives me negative 7? And when I add them, I get negative 6. Well, 7 is a prime number, and you only got really one set of options, which is a 7 and a 1. In order to make it negative, one of them has to be negative, and since they have to add up to negative 6, the one that's negative is 7. So here are our two factors. These are the ones that are going to work for us. We're going to take these two numbers, and we're going to put them in a set of parentheses that looks like this. I'm going to switch colors here. Make this nice and colorful. 0 is equal to x minus 7, there's the first factor, times x plus 1. It really doesn't matter what order those two come in, and the reason why is because if you do 7 times 1 or 1 times 7, you still get the same answer. That's called the commutative property of multiplication. Order doesn't matter. Okay, before we even move on, let's just FOIL this. Let's check to make sure that we did this thing correctly. If we were to FOIL this thing out, I'll change colors again. Let's make it magenta. X times x, that would be x squared. X times positive 1 gives me a positive 1x. Then I would have, zooming issues, a negative 7x, negative 7 times x for the inside terms. And then finally, negative 7 times 1 gives me a positive 1. And if I add those two things together, I do get negative 6x. And you can see we definitely, whoops, where the heck's, negative 7 times 1 is negative 7. Come on, negative 7. So assuming that you actually FOIL and multiply it correctly, we did get the correct factors. Is this problem done? No, it's not actually. So there was one thing that I didn't address on that green sheet. Let's go back to that green sheet. Let's see what it says. So now we're at the point where we can apply the zero product property, where we set our factors equal to 0. So that's what's happening right here. I'm going to get rid of some of this stuff here so it's not messing stuff up. And now you can see that we take that first factor and we set it equal to 0. X minus 2 is equal to 0. If that's the case, then I add that 2 over, I get x equals 2. okay? Or maybe it's x minus 1 is equal to 0. So I set that one equal to 0, add the 1 over, I get x is equal to 1. And here are two solutions that we expected to get when we have a quadratic equation. And notice that, like, I chose this equation on purpose because it's the same one that's up here. Those are the two same solutions that we got from this quadratic equation that were graphed here. That if we stick those two numbers in there, separately, stick the 1 in there for both x's, work it out, you get 0. Stick 2 in there for both those x's, work it out, you'd get 0. So that's what we want to do, is now it's time to apply the zero product property. I keep doing that. No, I'm correct. I'm good to go. All right, so we'll go back to our blue. You don't have to separate these if you don't want to. It's fine as long as you know you can get the right answers. I'm going to take this x minus 7, set it to 0. I'd add that 7 over, I'd have x equals 7. Boom. Take the second factor, x plus 1, set it equal to 0. Subtract the 1 over, x is equal to a negative 1. Bam. So here are my two possible solutions. Either one of these, when I stick that into the equation, should make it equal to 0, right? I'm going to test one of these things out. Let's pick one. How about let's pick the 7, right? If I take 7 squared minus 6 times 7 minus 7, 7 squared is 49, minus 6 times 7, I believe that thing is a 42, minus 7. Now do these just in order. 49 minus 42 gives us a positive 7, minus 7 gives us 0. It's equal to 0, it definitely checks out. The negative 1 would check out as well, okay? All right, so again, main idea here is if your quadratic equation is not equal to 0, make it equal to 0, moving stuff around first, and then you want to factor it. You want to factor it, and on this one, what we did is we looked for two numbers that have a product of negative 7, and they add up to negative 6, and we're going to put those two things in the set of parentheses, apply the zero product property by setting each one of those factors equal to 0 in order to get our two solutions. Okay, next couple of videos, these things are going to get maybe a little bit more challenging.